Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. From Pilgrims to Princes, the birth of the Crusader States. You begin not in Jerusalem, but far from it, in the damp villages and stone towns of late 11th century Europe. Life here is narrow and repetitive. Most people you pass will never travel more than a few miles from where they were born. Fields are plowed, taxes are paid, prayers are recited in a language few fully understand. News arrives slowly, carried by merchants or clergy, and often distorted by distance and fear. Yet in 1095, a message spreads with unusual speed and intensity. Jerusalem is in danger, and you are being called to do something about it. When Pope Urban II speaks at the Council of Clermont, his words are carried outward like ripples in a pond. You may never hear the speech directly, but you hear its echoes through sermons, rumors, and the excited talk of neighbors. The idea is simple enough. Travel east, protect Christian pilgrims, reclaim holy places. The reality, of course, is not simple at all. What follows is not a single, unified army marching with purpose, but a loose, uneven movement of people, knights, peasants, priests, and opportunists, each with their own reasons for going. If you choose to go, you sell what little you own or mortgage your land. Some carve crosses into their clothing, others sew them on with red thread. The journey ahead is barely imagined. Maps are scarce, and few of the people around you can read them anyway. Distances are guessed at, dangers are understated, and the land itself is spoken of more as an idea than a place. Jerusalem is not yet a city with streets and walls in your mind. It is a symbol, a promise, and perhaps an escape from debts or sins that feel heavier than the road ahead. As the movement grows, it fractures. One group leaves early, driven more by enthusiasm than planning. This so-called People's Crusade includes thousands who are poorly armed and poorly fed. You walk with them through unfamiliar territory, relying on charity or theft to survive. Hunger becomes a constant companion. Disease spreads easily when people sleep close together and drink from questionable streams. By the time this first wave reaches Anatolia, it is exhausted and vulnerable, and its destruction at the hands of Turkish forces is swift and largely unremarked upon back home. The later armies move more slowly and deliberately. If you are among them, you travel under the banners of nobles whose names will later fill chronicles. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto. Even here, unity is thin. Each leader has his own ambitions, his own followers, his own understanding of what this journey should accomplish. Supplies are a constant concern. You learn quickly that faith does not fill stomachs. Grain must be bought, seized, or begged for. Horses require fodder. Weapons rust if not maintained. Progress is measured not in miles, but in whether enough people survive to continue. When you reach the Byzantine Empire, you encounter something unexpected: cities that function. Roads are maintained. Officials keep records. Markets operate under rules you do not understand. The Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sees you not as a savior but as a problem to be managed. He extracts oaths from crusade leaders, promises of loyalty and the return of conquered lands. You may not be present for these negotiations, but you feel their consequences. Tension hangs over camps. Trust is thin, and misunderstandings are common. Crossing into Anatolia, the land becomes harsher. The heat is relentless and water is scarce. Turkish forces avoid direct confrontation, harassing supply lines and attacking stragglers. You learn the importance of discipline the hard way. Those who wander off often do not return. Marching becomes slower, more cautious. The romance of pilgrimage fades, replaced by routine suffering, sore feet, cracked lips, the constant calculation of how much food remains. When Antioch finally appears, its walls seem impossibly large. The siege that follows is long, grinding, and deeply uncomfortable. You spend months in makeshift camps, exposed to weather and disease. Food shortages become severe. Animals vanish first, then leather, then anything remotely edible. Morale wavers. Desertion is common. Yet the city eventually falls, not through strength alone but through negotiation and betrayal. Victory does not bring relief. Instead, you find yourself trapped inside the city, now besieged in turn. It is here that the nature of this crusade begins to shift. Leaders argue over control. Visions and relics are discovered at convenient moments, restoring morale just enough to continue. When the Crusaders finally break free and resume their march south, they are fewer, harder, and more experienced than when they began. You no longer think of yourself as a pilgrim. You are something else now, shaped by months of attrition. By the time Jerusalem comes into view in the summer of 1099, it is no longer an abstract goal. It is a city with walls that must be breached, wells that must be secured, and defenders who are very real. The final assault will be brief but brutal, and afterward nothing will be the same. Yet even as victory approaches, a quieter question lingers beneath the noise of celebration and bloodshed. Once the city is taken, what exactly are you supposed to do with it? When Jerusalem falls in July of 1099, the event is decisive, but it is not conclusive. You might imagine that the capture of such a powerful symbol would bring clarity and closure. Instead, it creates a new and uncomfortable problem: possession. Taking a city is one thing, keeping it, governing it, feeding it, and defending it year after year is something else entirely. Almost immediately, the Crusaders are forced to confront a reality they had not seriously planned for. They are far from home, surrounded by unfamiliar populations, and there is no clear instruction for what comes next. In the weeks following the conquest, many Crusaders leave. Their vows, as they understand them, are fulfilled. They have prayed at the Holy Sepulchre, performed acts of penance, and survived. The road back to Europe is long, but it leads home. Those who remain are a minority, and among them are men who begin to see opportunity where others see obligation. Titles are distributed, often hastily. Godfrey of Bouillon refuses to call himself king, choosing instead the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. But the distinction is more symbolic than practical. Authority must exist, and someone must exercise it. You notice how quickly priorities change. The language of pilgrimage gives way to the language of administration. Who controls which villages? Who collects which taxes? Who commands which garrison? The land itself does not adjust to these new arrangements. The climate is unforgiving. European crops do not always grow as expected. Water management becomes an urgent concern. Wells must be maintained, cisterns cleaned, irrigation channels repaired. These are not glorious tasks, but without them, the entire project fails. The population of the region is diverse and largely non-Latin Christian. Muslims, Eastern Christians, Jews, and others continue to live where they always have. You interact with them not as enemies on a battlefield, but as neighbors, laborers, and tenants. Many villages remain intact, paying taxes to new lords much as they did to old ones. Pragmatism outweighs ideology in these early years. There are too few settlers to replace the existing population, and too little time to experiment with radical change. Security is a constant concern. The territory held by the Crusaders is narrow and fragmented, connected by roads that are vulnerable to attack. Castles become essential, not just as military installations but as symbols of control. You see them rise on hills and along trade routes, built with local stone and adapted to the landscape. Construction is slow and labor-intensive. Every block moved represents manpower diverted from farming or fighting. Yet without these fortifications, the countryside cannot be held. Leadership changes hands quickly. Godfrey dies in 1100, and his brother Baldwin takes the crown he refused. Baldwin is pragmatic and energetic, willing to compromise when necessary and ruthless when required. Under his rule, the Kingdom of Jerusalem begins to resemble a functioning state, at least in outline. Laws are adapted from European customs but adjusted to local conditions. Courts are established, not only for nobles but for merchants and townspeople. These legal structures are incomplete and often contradictory, but they provide a framework that did not exist before. Beyond Jerusalem, Other Crusader states emerge. Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli each develop their own character and problems. Edessa is distant and exposed, difficult to reinforce and harder to defend. Antioch is wealthy and strategically vital, but its leadership is frequently divided. Tripoli takes decades to fully consolidate. You might travel between these regions and notice how little unity there actually is. Cooperation happens, but it is fragile, often dependent on personal relationships rather than shared institutions. Daily life settles into a routine that is both familiar and strange. Markets operate according to local rhythms. Bread is baked, animals are slaughtered, and cloth is dyed. Latin Christians adapt to new foods and customs, sometimes reluctantly. Olive oil replaces butter. Flatbreads are more common than loaves. Spices appear in kitchens that once knew only salt. Language barriers persist, but necessity produces a kind of working understanding. Trade continues because it must. Defense remains the central concern. Raids are common, small-scale, but persistent. You learn to travel armed even on short journeys. Harvests are planned with the expectation of loss. When armies gather on the horizon, everything stops. Fields are abandoned, livestock driven into fortresses, and civilians crowd behind walls. Warfare here is seasonal, shaped by climate and supply rather than grand strategy. Long sieges are rare but devastating when they occur. Religious institutions play a growing role. Churches are rebuilt or repurposed. Monasteries acquire land and influence. New orders begin to take shape, blending spiritual vows with practical responsibilities. Care for pilgrims becomes an organized activity, complete with hostels and hospitals. These institutions provide stability, but they also consume resources and attract attention. Protection becomes a constant negotiation between sacred duty and military necessity. You begin to sense that the Crusader states exist in a kind of balance, held together by effort rather than inevitability. Every year requires renewed commitment. Reinforcements arrive from Europe, but unpredictably. Some years bring many, others bring few. The population remains thin and losses are hard to replace. Success depends not on dramatic victories, but on endurance, on maintaining roads, enforcing laws, and keeping enough people alive to plant the next crop. As time passes, the initial fervor of conquest fades into something quieter and more precarious. These lands are no longer newly won, but they are not yet secure. The question is no longer how they were taken, but whether they can last. Surrounded by rivals who are learning, adapting, and waiting, you may find yourself wondering how long a state built by pilgrims can survive as a kingdom. By the second decade of the 12th century, the Crusader states no longer feel temporary, at least to those living within them. What began as an armed pilgrimage has hardened into a set of political realities. Titles are inherited, not just claimed. Children are born who have never seen Europe and never will. For you, life in the Kingdom of Jerusalem or one of its neighboring states is no longer defined by marching or siege, but by the steady labor of maintenance. Survival depends less on faith alone, and more on administration, compromise, and habit. The kingdom's borders are never clearly fixed. Maps suggest solid lines, but on the ground, control fades gradually as you move away from fortified towns. Authority is strongest where walls stand and weakest where fields stretch uninterrupted toward the horizon. Villages may pay taxes one year and withhold them the next, depending on who seems more powerful at the moment. Loyalty is often transactional rather than ideological. Protection is exchanged for obedience, but protection is not always reliable. You notice how thinly spread the ruling class is. A handful of Frankish nobles control vast areas, relying on small garrisons and local intermediaries. Many castles are undermanned, their defenses impressive but their numbers insufficient. A successful defense often depends on warning rather than resistance, on seeing an enemy force early enough to retreat behind stone. When communication fails, disaster follows quietly and quickly. The economy is functional but fragile. The Crusader states sit astride important trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to inland markets. Ports like Acre and Jaffa become vital lifelines. Goods flow in: grain, weapons, pilgrims, and money. Goods flow out: sugar, olive oil, textiles. Italian merchants, Venetians, Genoese, Pisans gained significant privileges in exchange for naval support. Their quarters inside cities operate almost as independent enclaves, governed by their own rules. This arrangement keeps trade alive, but it also means that economic power is not fully in the hands of the crown. Agriculture remains the foundation of daily life. Fields are worked by local peasants who understand the land far better than their new rulers. Crop cycles follow ancient patterns. When harvests are good, stability feels possible. When they fail, everything tightens. Grain prices rise. Garrisons go underfed. Discontent grows quietly, not as rebellion, but as withdrawal, people moving away, withholding labor, or simply enduring with less enthusiasm. The military situation evolves as well. The early reliance on temporary crusading armies proves unreliable. In response, permanent military institutions take shape. Groups like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers begin as caretakers of pilgrims and the sick, but their role expands. You see them garrisoning key routes, manning fortresses, and providing a disciplined core of professional fighters. Their vows bind them to the land in a way most secular lords are not. They bring stability, but also a shift in power. Loyalty now runs through institutions as much as through families. Relations with neighboring Muslim states are complex and rarely static. Periods of open warfare alternate with truces, trade agreements, and quiet coexistence. You may hear Arabic spoken in markets and Latin in courts, sometimes within the same building. Hostilities are real, but they are not constant. Both sides are constrained by logistics, internal politics, and the demands of daily life. War is something prepared for, not something continuously fought. Leadership continues to matter. Capable kings and regents can stabilize the kingdom for years at a time. Poor leadership accelerates decline. Succession crises are particularly dangerous. When authority is unclear, alliances fracture and enemies test boundaries. You learn that a kingdom like this cannot afford long periods of uncertainty. Every delay is an invitation. Despite these vulnerabilities, the Crusader States endure longer than many expected. Decades pass, laws are refined, records are kept, churches ring bells at regular hours. Life develops a rhythm that feels almost normal. For those born here, this is not a frontier experiment but a homeland, however precarious. Yet beneath that routine lies constant awareness. Every adult understands that the kingdom exists by effort alone. Nothing about it is guaranteed. As the wider Islamic world begins to consolidate under stronger leadership, pressure increases. The balance that once favored fragmented opponents begins to shift. You may not yet see the full shape of what is coming, but you feel the strain. Reinforcements from Europe arrive less frequently and with less enthusiasm. The memory of the First Crusade fades into legend, no longer a living motivation. By the time the first generation of Crusaders has passed, their creation stands complete and incomplete at the same time. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is real, with laws, borders, and people who depend on it. Yet it remains fundamentally vulnerable, reliant on cooperation, adaptation, and a steady supply of attention from far away. It is a state born not from careful planning, but from momentum, necessity, and belief. Looking back, the birth of the Crusader States is less a story of conquest than of persistence. They were not inevitable, nor were they sustainable by force alone. Their early survival depended on mundane choices: how to collect taxes, how to share water, how to negotiate with neighbors, and how to convince ordinary people to stay. In that sense, their legacy is a quiet reminder that even the most dramatic events in history are ultimately shaped by routine decisions, repeated day after day, until they become a way of life, or until they can no longer be sustained at all. Story 2. Living between faiths: daily life in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. If you wake in the Kingdom of Jerusalem sometime in the early 12th century, your morning does not begin with battle cries or prayers shouted across walls. It begins with ordinary sounds. Animals stir. Water is drawn from cisterns. Bread is prepared, often before sunrise because the heat will come quickly. The land does not care who rules it today. It demands the same routines it always has, and your survival depends on learning them. Despite how the Crusader States are often remembered, most days are not defined by warfare. They are defined by coexistence. Not harmonious, not equal, but constant. Muslims, Eastern Christians, Jews, and Latin Christians live close together, often in the same towns, sometimes on the same streets. You learn early that daily life here requires a kind of practical tolerance. Ideology matters less than whether the well still works and whether the harvest comes in on time. In cities like Jerusalem, Acre, or Nablus, neighborhoods are loosely organized by community, but they are not sealed off. Markets draw everyone together. You hear multiple languages: Arabic, Greek, Armenian, Latin, sometimes within a single conversation. Trade creates its own grammar. Prices are negotiated with gestures as much as words. Measures are argued over. Trust is partial, built slowly, and easily broken, but necessity keeps people returning to the same stalls day after day. If you are a Latin Christian settler, you live as a minority. The ruling class is Frankish, but the population is not. Most of the people working the land, baking bread, pressing olives, and maintaining irrigation systems were here long before the Crusaders arrived. You depend on their knowledge even if you do not fully trust them. They know when to plant, how to store grain against insects, how to manage water in dry months. Ignoring that knowledge is not an option. Rural life follows patterns that change little. Villages pay taxes, sometimes in coin, often in kind. Grain, oil, and livestock move upward through layers of administration until they reach a lord or a religious institution. The system feels familiar if you come from Europe, but the details are different. Crops fail differently here. Rain is less predictable. A missed season has consequences that can last years. You learn to think in terms of reserves rather than surplus. Religion shapes time itself. The day is punctuated by calls to prayer, bells, and ritual observances that overlap and sometimes compete. You might hear the muezzin call from a distance while a church prepares for Mass. These sounds are not usually a cause for conflict. They are part of the landscape. What matters more is how religious identity intersects with law. Different communities are judged by different courts, according to different traditions. This pluralism is not designed for fairness so much as for manageability. In Jerusalem itself, sacred space is carefully controlled. Certain areas are restricted at certain times. Pilgrims arrive in waves, disrupting routines. Inns fill, prices rise, tempers short. For local residents, pilgrims are both a burden and a source of income. They buy food, hire guides, and donate to churches. They also consume resources quickly and leave behind little stability. You learn to endure their presence with patience, knowing they will move on. Housing reflects adaptation. Frankish settlers modify existing buildings rather than replacing them. Thick walls keep out heat. Courtyards provide light and airflow. Roofs are flat, not steep, and rainwater is carefully collected. Over time, European styles blend with local practices. What works is kept. What doesn't quietly disappears. Survival encourages humility, even if ideology resists it. Food tells a similar story. Diets change. Wheat bread remains important, but flatbreads become common. Olive oil replaces animal fats in many kitchens. Lentils, chickpeas, figs, and dates appear regularly. Spices once rare in Europe become familiar. Meals are simple, repetitive, and shaped by availability rather than preference. You eat what keeps you alive, not what reminds you of home. Tension is always present, but it is often low-level. Disputes arise over taxes, property boundaries, or accusations of theft. Violence happens, but it is usually localized. Large-scale massacres are rare after the initial conquest, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. Stability benefits those in power. Fear is expensive to maintain. Routine obedience is cheaper. Yet coexistence has limits. Legal inequality is clear. Latin Christians hold political authority. Non-Latins pay additional taxes and face restrictions. These measures breed resentment that does not always express itself openly. Instead, it settles into memory. People remember who benefits and who endures. This memory shapes how communities respond when power shifts, as it inevitably does. Children grow up multilingual without thinking much about it. Identity is practical before it is ideological. You are who your family is, who your neighbors are, and who your landlord is. Loyalty is layered and sometimes contradictory. You may pay taxes to a Frankish lord, pray in an Eastern Christian church, and trade daily with Muslim merchants. None of this feels unusual once it becomes routine. What defines life most strongly is uncertainty. Harvests can fail. Armies can appear with little warning. Laws can change with a new ruler. You plan for the short term. You store what you can. You maintain relationships because they may matter later. Survival here is not heroic. It is careful. As evening comes, the city quiets unevenly. Gates are closed. Lamps are lit. People retreat into familiar spaces. You reflect, perhaps without words, on the strange balance that allows this place to function at all. So many differences pressed into such a small territory, held together not by agreement, but by habit and necessity. And as you lie down to sleep, you may wonder how long this fragile coexistence can last before fear, ambition, or faith pushes it beyond its limits. As days turn into years, coexistence in the Kingdom of Jerusalem becomes less about belief and more about structure. You begin to notice that daily life is shaped not by grand declarations of faith, but by rules often unwritten, occasionally enforced, and constantly negotiated. These rules determine who works which land, who pays which taxes, and who has the right to complain when something goes wrong. They are not consistent, and they are rarely fair, but they are what keep the kingdom functioning at all. Law in the Crusader States is layered. If you are a Latin Christian noble, you answer to one set of courts, guided by customs brought from Europe and adapted slowly to local conditions. If you are a merchant, especially one connected to the Italian trading cities, you may be judged under entirely different rules. If you belong to an Eastern Christian, Jewish, or Muslim community, your internal disputes are often handled within your own religious courts until they intersect with the interests of the ruling elite. Then jurisdiction becomes flexible. You learn quickly that justice here is less about principle than about balance. The ruling authorities want order, steady revenue, and predictable labor. They are not interested in enforcing uniform belief if it risks unrest. As a result, many everyday conflicts are resolved quietly. A boundary dispute between villages might be settled by compromise rather than punishment. A missing tax payment might be delayed rather than enforced, especially after a poor harvest. The appearance of authority matters, but its heavy use is avoided when possible. Labor is the backbone of everything. Most people you encounter work the land in some capacity. Farming in this region requires careful attention to timing and water. Irrigation channels must be cleared regularly. Cisterns must be protected from contamination. These tasks are performed by local populations who have inherited the knowledge through generations. Frankish lords depend on this expertise, even as they extract rents and crops from it. You may sense the imbalance, but you also see the mutual dependence. Urban labor is more varied but no less essential. Artisans produce tools, clothing, pottery, and weapons. Many crafts continue uninterrupted from the pre-Crusader period. A blacksmith does not need to change his methods because the ruler has changed. What does change is who commissions the work and who pays for it. Military demand increases the production of arms and armor, but this demand fluctuates. In quieter years, craftsmen turn back to civilian needs, repairing carts, hinges, and household tools. Markets remain the central point of interaction. You spend more time there than anywhere else outside your home. They are noisy, crowded, and carefully regulated. Officials inspect weights and measures, sometimes honestly, sometimes selectively. Taxes are collected at gates and stalls. Disputes over prices are common and rarely ideological. Everyone understands that trade keeps the city alive. When markets fail because of siege, disease, or blockade, the consequences ripple outward quickly. Disease is a constant presence, though rarely discussed openly. Illness spreads easily in dense cities, especially in summer. Medical knowledge exists, drawn from Greek, Arabic, and local traditions, but access is uneven. Wealth and status determine treatment. Hospitals attached to religious institutions provide care, but resources are limited. Many people simply endure sickness and hope it passes. Death is common enough that it becomes part of the background, noticed but not always mourned deeply. Family life adapts to these conditions. Marriages are often practical, especially among settlers. Alliances matter. Dowries are negotiated carefully. Interfaith marriages are rare and discouraged, but informal relationships occur, especially in urban settings. Children grow up navigating multiple identities without fully naming them. They learn early who holds power and how to avoid drawing attention. Education is limited, but apprenticeship and imitation transmit most skills. Religious practice continues, but it is shaped by proximity. You attend your own rituals while being constantly aware of others happening nearby. Major religious festivals bring tension as well as celebration. Processions require protection. Access to sacred sites is negotiated repeatedly. The memory of violence during the conquest lingers, influencing how space is shared. Certain routes are avoided at certain times. Caution becomes habitual. You begin to understand that peace here is not the absence of conflict, but the management of it. Small disputes are allowed to burn out rather than flare up. Insults are swallowed. Offenses are remembered but not always acted upon. This restraint is not born of harmony, but of calculation. Everyone knows how quickly order can collapse. Communication across communities relies on intermediaries. Translators, guides, scribes, and local leaders play crucial roles. Their influence often exceeds their formal rank. A trusted intermediary can prevent violence or enable it, depending on circumstance. You learn their names, even if you do not fully trust them. They are the quiet hinges on which daily life turns. Outside the cities, life is more exposed. Roads are dangerous, especially for small groups. Travelers move in caravans when possible. Way stations and monasteries offer shelter but not always safety. Banditry exists alongside warfare, blurring the line between political violence and crime. Protection is uneven, and justice even more so. You plan journeys carefully and avoid unnecessary travel. Over time, patterns settle. You begin to predict when taxes will be raised, when soldiers will pass through, when markets will be disrupted. This predictability creates a sense of normalcy, even under unequal conditions. People adapt not because they accept the system as just, but because adaptation is easier than resistance. Yet beneath this surface stability, memory accumulates. Every small injustice is stored quietly. Every favor is noted. Communities remember who protected them and who exploited them. This memory does not fade quickly. It waits, shaping responses to future crises. As evening falls again and daily routines repeat, you may feel that life here is sustainable if only just. The kingdom functions. People eat, work, pray, and sleep. But you also sense that this balance depends on circumstances that can change suddenly. A new ruler, a failed harvest, or a shifting alliance could undo years of careful negotiation. And as you listen to the familiar sounds of night settling over the city, you may find yourself wondering whether this careful, fragile order is strong enough to survive when pressure comes not from within, but from beyond the horizon. Over time, you begin to understand that the daily life you have come to know in the Kingdom of Jerusalem exists in a narrow space between pressure and collapse. It is not fragile in the sense of being easily shattered, but it is dependent on conditions that are rarely stable for long. The routines that make coexistence possible, markets, courts, harvests, negotiated access to space, are resilient only so long as no single force overwhelms the others. When that balance shifts, daily life changes first, long before cities fall or battles are fought. The earliest signs are subtle. Taxes increase slightly then again. Soldiers appear more frequently on the roads, not marching in great armies but moving in small groups requisitioning supplies. Grain that once flowed to markets is redirected to storehouses. Prices rise unevenly. Those with coin can manage, those without begin to ration. These changes are not announced. You notice them only because you are paying attention, because daily survival depends on noticing. Religious boundaries harden under stress. Where once access to shared spaces was negotiated flexibly, restrictions become stricter. Guards enforce rules that were previously ignored. Processions are shortened or rerouted. Complaints that would once have been settled quietly now reach courts, where decisions are harsher and less patient. Fear does not create new divisions so much as deepen existing ones. In rural areas, the effects are more immediate. A failed harvest or a military raid can undo years of stability. Villages that once paid taxes regularly begin to fall behind. Some are abandoned altogether, their inhabitants moving toward fortified towns or disappearing into less controlled regions. Land goes uncultivated. Irrigation systems fall into disrepair. Recovery is slow, if it happens at all. You learn that agriculture here is not easily restarted once disrupted. Urban life tightens. In see fewer pilgrims. Merchants hedge their risks, trading less and charging more. Italian trading quarters remain active longer than most, protected by naval power and international agreements, but even they feel the strain. When ports are threatened, everything else follows. You come to see the sea as a kind of invisible wall. When it is open, the kingdom breathes. When it is closed, it suffocates. Disease becomes more deadly during these periods, not because it is new, but because resilience is lower. Malnutrition weakens bodies. Overcrowding increases. Medical care, already limited, is stretched thinner. Death becomes more visible. Funerals are frequent and quiet. Life continues, but with less confidence. Children growing up in these years learn different lessons than those born earlier. They are more cautious, more aware of power and its limits. Multilingualism remains common, but trust is narrower. Identity becomes more fixed, less negotiable. You sense that the space for ambiguity is shrinking, replaced by clearer lines that are easier to defend but harder to cross. Yet even as pressure mounts, coexistence does not vanish entirely. Trade continues where it can. Neighbors still rely on one another for small favors, shared tools, information. Survival encourages cooperation even when ideology discourages it. These interactions rarely appear in chronicles, but they are the reason cities continue to function at all. Large systems fail slowly because small ones persist. When open conflict finally arrives, it feels almost anticlimactic at the level of daily life. Sieges interrupt routines brutally, but they do not erase the habits formed over decades. People know where to go, what to carry, how to wait. Civilians retreat behind walls, bringing what they can. Life becomes narrower, but it does not stop. Waiting becomes the primary occupation. After a siege, whether it ends in relief, surrender, or conquest, daily life resumes in altered form. Authority changes hands. Laws are rewritten or reinterpreted. Taxes are reassessed. But many of the same people remain. The same fields need planting. The same wells need cleaning. The land does not reset with each political shift. You begin to see that ordinary life here is remarkably continuous, even as rulers come and go. Looking back over years or decades, you realize that the Kingdom of Jerusalem is less a single society than a sequence of adaptations. Each generation inherits a set of constraints and learns how to live within them. Faith remains important, but it is woven into routines rather than standing apart from them. Identity is expressed through practice as much as belief. What you eat, where you walk, whom you greet, and when you keep silent. The legacy of this daily life is not one of harmony, but of endurance. People live together not because they fully understood one another, but because separation was impossible. The kingdom's greatest achievement may not have been its military victories or sacred architecture, but the fact that, for a time, ordinary life continued at all under extraordinary conditions. When the Crusader States eventually weaken and fall, Much of what defined daily life outlives them. Markets persist. Agricultural patterns remain. Communities adapt again to new rulers. Memory absorbs the Frankish period as one layer among many. For the land and its people, this era becomes part of a longer story rather than a definitive break. As you drift away from this period, the sounds of daily life fade first. The bargaining in markets, the overlapping calls to prayer and bells, the steady labor that made everything else possible. What remains is the understanding that history is not only shaped by battles and kings, but by the quiet persistence of people who wake each day, adapt to new pressures, and find ways to live between forces far larger than themselves. And you may find yourself wondering, as the focus shifts from streets and fields to walls and towers, how these ordinary routines influence the way the Crusader States chose to defend themselves against a world that was slowly closing in. Story 3. Castles, Stone, and Silence, the Architecture of Survival. If you travel through the Crusader States in the early 12th century, one feature gradually comes to dominate the landscape: stone. Not the decorative stone of cathedrals back in Europe, but heavy, functional masonry shaped into walls, towers, and keeps. These structures rise slowly from hills, river crossings, and coastal roads, often in places that feel inconvenient or exposed. Their purpose is not beauty or comfort. It is endurance. Castles in the Holy Land are not built because rulers expect peace. They are built because peace cannot be assumed. Every road must be watched, every fertile valley controlled, every port protected. The Crusader States lack the population to patrol their territory continuously, so they rely instead on fixed points of strength. If you hold the castle, you hold the surrounding land, at least in theory. Construction is an act of long-term thinking in a place defined by short-term survival. When a lord decides to build or expand a fortress, he commits resources that will not pay off immediately. Stone must be quarried, shaped, and transported. Labor must be organized and fed. Skilled masons are scarce and valuable. Many castles begin as modest structures: wooden towers, earthworks, reused Byzantine or Islamic fortifications, and are upgraded gradually as circumstances allow. You see how builders adapt to the land. Walls are thick, not tall, designed to absorb impact rather than impress. Towers are placed to command approaches rather than to dominate skylines. Slits for arrows are narrow and practical. Battlements are shaped for function. There is little ornamentation. Even chapels within castles are plain. Everything unnecessary is omitted because maintenance is as important as construction. Water is the first concern. A castle without a reliable water supply is a liability, not a defense. You notice how cisterns are carved deep into rock, lined carefully to prevent leakage. Rainwater is collected obsessively. In some fortresses, water storage determines the entire layout. A siege can be endured only as long as water holds out. Food shortages are dangerous. Thirst is fatal. Location matters more than size. Some castles guard river crossings or mountain passes. Others sit near villages, serving as both protection and reminder of authority. Coastal fortresses anchor supply lines from Europe, ensuring that men and material can arrive by sea even when roads are unsafe. Inland castles are often isolated, connected to the rest of the kingdom by narrow tracks that are easily cut. Garrison life in these places is quiet, repetitive, and tense. If you live or serve in one of these castles, your days are defined by routine. Watch rotations, maintenance, training, and long periods of waiting. You inspect walls for cracks. You clear debris from drains. You practice responding to alarms that may never come. Silence becomes familiar. When something does happen, a raid, a distant signal fire, it feels sharp and sudden against the background of stillness. Castles also function as administrative centers. Taxes are collected and stored here. Legal disputes are heard in their halls. Villagers come to the gates to seek protection or judgment. This dual role creates tension. A castle must be accessible enough to govern but secure enough to defend. Too much openness invites risk. Too much isolation undermines authority. Balancing these demands is an ongoing challenge. As the decades pass, castle design evolves. Early fortifications reflect European traditions, but experience reshapes them. Crusader builders learn from local and Muslim techniques, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly through observation. They adopt sloped walls, complex gate systems, and layered defenses. Some castles grow into vast complexes, capable of housing hundreds of soldiers and civilians. Others remain small but strategically vital. The rise of the military orders accelerates this process. The Templars and Hospitallers inherit or construct some of the most formidable fortresses in the region. Their resources and institutional continuity allow them to think beyond the lifespan of individual lords. When you walk through one of their castles, you sense a different scale of ambition. These are not personal strongholds, but nodes in a defensive network that spans regions. Yet even the strongest castles are not invulnerable. Siege technology advances. Attackers learn patience. Supply lines can be cut. A fortress delays defeat. It does not prevent it indefinitely. You see castles fall not because their walls fail, but because relief does not arrive. Isolation is their greatest weakness. Despite this, castles exert a powerful psychological effect. They signal permanence in a land where permanence is rare. They tell settlers that someone intends to stay. They tell rivals that control is claimed, even if contested. For ordinary people, they are both refuge and reminder, protection in times of danger, authority at all times. At night, castles are especially quiet. Torches burn low. Guards walk the walls, listening to wind and distant sounds that may or may not matter. The stone holds the day's heat and releases it slowly. Inside, people sleep lightly, attuned to alarms. Outside, fields lie dark and uncertain. You begin to understand that these structures are less about fighting than about waiting. Waiting for reinforcements, waiting for harvests, waiting for decisions made far away. Castles exist to buy time in a landscape where time is always in short supply. And as more of them rise across the hills and plains of the Holy Land, you may find yourself wondering whether stone and discipline can truly compensate for thin manpower and distant support, or whether these fortresses are monuments to a confidence that the future may not justify. When you pass through the gate of a Crusader castle, the world narrows. The horizon disappears behind stone, and your attention turns inward to space, routine, and limits. Life inside the walls is not dramatic. It is constrained, repetitive, and shaped by the understanding that the castle exists for a single overriding purpose: to endure longer than the danger outside. Space is carefully allocated. Nothing is accidental. Courtyards serve multiple roles: drilling ground, market space, animal pens in emergencies. Rooms are small, often windowless, designed to stay cool and secure rather than comfortable. You learn quickly that privacy is rare. Sound carries easily along stone corridors. Smells linger. People adapt by lowering expectations rather than trying to change the structure. The garrison is smaller than outsiders imagine. Even large castles are often held by a few dozen soldiers, sometimes fewer. Every person has multiple roles. A guard on the wall in the morning may be repairing armor in the afternoon and helping ration food in the evening. Specialization exists, but necessity overrides it. When manpower is limited, everyone learns to do a little of everything. Routine keeps fear manageable. Watches are scheduled precisely. Bells or horns mark the passage of time. You wake, eat, work, and sleep according to patterns that rarely change. This predictability is comforting. It makes long periods of inactivity tolerable. You stop measuring time in days and begin to measure it in maintenance cycles: how often walls are inspected, how often water levels are checked, how often supplies are counted. Food inside a castle is plain and controlled. Rations are calculated conservatively, based on the assumption that a siege could begin at any moment. Fresh food is welcome but not relied upon. Grain, dried legumes, salted meat, and oil form the core of most meals. You learn to eat without excess. Waste is treated as a failure of discipline. During shortages, meals shrink quietly without announcement. Water management dominates planning. You check cisterns obsessively. You are aware of evaporation, contamination, and leakage. Water is drawn carefully, measured by habit rather than instrument. During dry seasons, anxiety grows even without an enemy in sight. A cracked lining or blocked channel can threaten the entire garrison. Repairing these systems is slow and meticulous work, but it is treated with the seriousness of combat. Training is regular but restrained. Weapons are precious. You practice movements more often than strikes. Archery drills emphasize accuracy over volume. Cavalry practice, when space allows, is limited and controlled. Horses are valuable and vulnerable, requiring care that competes with human needs. When resources are scarce, animals suffer first, a reality everyone understands but no one states openly. Civilians are often present. Castle life is not exclusively military. Families of soldiers, servants, craftsmen, and refugees occupy space within the walls, especially during periods of tension. Their presence complicates everything. They consume resources, but they also provide labor. Children grow up within sight of battlements, absorbing the rhythms of garrison life as normal. For them, stone walls are not symbols of war, but of home. Authority inside the castle is visible and immediate. Orders are given face to face. Discipline is enforced through routine rather than punishment. Severe penalties exist, but they are used sparingly. A garrison cannot afford internal conflict. Grievances are managed quietly. Minor disputes are settled quickly, often by compromise rather than judgment. Cohesion matters more than strict fairness. Communication with the outside world is irregular. Messengers come and go when roads are safe. Signal fires and flags provide limited information. Long periods pass with no news at all. You learn to live with uncertainty. Decisions are made with incomplete knowledge, based on patterns and experience rather than certainty. This uncertainty becomes a background condition, like weather. When a threat appears, routine tightens. Watches are doubled. Supplies are checked again. Civilians are gathered into safer areas. Gates close earlier and open later. There is no dramatic announcement, just a shift in posture. You feel it in the way people move more deliberately, speak less, listen more. The castle becomes inward-facing, conserving energy and attention. Sieges test everything at once. Time stretches. Days blend together. The outside world reduces to sounds and shadows beyond the walls. Attacks may be sporadic or relentless. More often, the real enemy is waiting. Supplies diminish slowly. Water levels drop almost imperceptibly at first, then with alarming speed. Morale fluctuates. Small successes repairing damage, repelling a probing attack are celebrated quietly. Losses are absorbed without ceremony. Inside, social boundaries flatten. Status still exists, but shared vulnerability blurs it. You eat the same food as your neighbors. You endure the same heat, the same thirst. Authority remains, but it feels closer, more human. Leaders are visible, subject to the same conditions as everyone else. Their competence matters more than their lineage. When relief arrives or when surrender becomes unavoidable, the transition is abrupt. Gates open. Routine dissolves. New authorities assert control. Terms are negotiated, sometimes honored, sometimes not. The castle's role shifts again from barrier to prize. Those inside adapt because adaptation is what they have always done. In quieter times, castles influence the surrounding region simply by existing. Villagers adjust their lives to the presence of walls and garrisons. Markets form nearby. Roads are redirected. The castle becomes a point of reference, a place to flee to, trade with, or avoid, depending on circumstance. Its shadow extends beyond its walls. Yet living inside one teaches you a hard lesson. Strength is finite. Stone erodes. Supplies run out. Attention wanes. A castle's endurance depends not only on its construction, but on the wider system that supports it: roads, ports, allies, and the willingness of distant rulers to send help. Without that, Even the strongest walls become an exercise in delay. As years pass and castles multiply across the landscape, you may begin to sense a paradox. Each new fortress makes local control easier but overall defense more complex. Resources are spread thinner. Garrison needs compete. No single castle can be abandoned, but not all can be saved. And as you walk the walls at dusk, listening to the wind move across stone that has already outlasted many lives, you may wonder whether these fortresses are anchors holding the Crusader States in place or weights slowly pulling them under. Over decades, the castles of the Crusader States begin to feel less like new solutions and more like inherited obligations. You no longer think of them as responses to immediate danger, but as permanent fixtures that demand constant attention. Each wall, tower, and gate represents decisions made long ago, under different conditions, by people who are no longer present to explain them. You maintain these structures not because they promise victory, but because abandoning them feels like an admission that the entire project is shrinking. As time passes, castles accumulate layers. Repairs are made with different stone, slightly different techniques. Older walls are thickened rather than replaced. New towers are added to meet evolving threats. Gate systems become more complex, not out of ambition, but out of experience. Every successful or failed siege leaves behind lessons that are translated into architecture. You can read history here, not in words but in masonry. Yet the environment works steadily against permanence. Earthquakes crack walls without warning. Heat and wind erode mortar. Seasonal rains undermine foundations. Maintaining a castle is never finished. Even in years of peace, labor is consumed simply keeping structures usable. This constant drain shapes strategy more than most battles. Resources spent on stone cannot be spent on men, horses, or diplomacy. Every reinforcement choice excludes another. The relationship between castles and population becomes more strained over time. Early on, fortresses are symbols of protection, drawing settlers and trade. Later, as pressure increases, they can feel like burdens. Villagers are required to contribute labor and supplies. Taxes are justified in the name of defense, but the benefits feel increasingly distant. When a castle successfully holds out during a raid, gratitude follows. When it fails, or when it simply watches from a hill, as fields are burned, resentment grows quietly. Castles also shape how wars are fought. Campaigns become less about open battle and more about movement between fortified points. Armies avoid strongholds unless necessary. Sieges are chosen carefully because they are costly and slow. The presence of castles channels violence, concentrating it at specific locations while leaving other areas exposed. You begin to see that fortifications do not eliminate danger, they redistribute it. As opposing powers adapt, the psychological balance shifts. Early on, the sight of a Crusader castle signals a boundary that may not be worth testing. Later, as attackers gain confidence and experience, that signal weakens. A fortress becomes a challenge rather than a deterrent. Stories spread of walls breached, towers undermined, garrisons starved into submission. Each fallen castle erodes the authority of those that remain. Inside the walls, this change is felt long before it is openly acknowledged. Supplies are stockpiled more aggressively. Drills become more frequent. Discussions about evacuation plans, once unthinkable, occur quietly. You hear them in fragments, never as formal policy. The idea that a castle might be abandoned challenges the very logic of its existence, yet the possibility can no longer be ignored. The military orders respond differently than secular lords. With broader resources and longer institutional memory, they are more willing to concentrate strength. Some fortresses are expanded into massive complexes, designed to withstand prolonged isolation. Others are deliberately neglected, allowed to fade into irrelevance. This selectivity reflects a hard truth. Not every position can be held forever. Choosing which stones to save becomes as important as knowing how to defend them. Castles also influence memory. Long after their military value declines, they remain in the landscape, shaping how later generations understand the past. For those who live near them, they are landmarks, sources of stone, shelters for animals, or places of legend. Their original purpose fades, replaced by new meanings layered over old ones. Even ruined, they command attention. When castles finally fall, whether through conquest, negotiation, or abandonment, the transition is rarely dramatic. Gates open, flags change. New garrisons move in or not at all. Often, life around the castle continues with minimal interruption. The walls still stand. The wells still function. The same practical concerns remain. Authority shifts, but the structure persists, waiting to be used again. Looking back, you begin to see that castles did not fail because they were poorly built or poorly defended. They failed because they were part of a system that depended on distant support, limited manpower, and sustained interest from elsewhere. Stone could delay outcomes, but it could not create new resources or resolve deeper imbalances. Fortresses bought time, and time was used as well as it could be, but time alone was not enough. In this sense, the castles of the Crusader States are less symbols of dominance than of effort. They represent the determination to hold ground in an environment that constantly resists permanence. They show how far organization, discipline, and engineering can go and where they stop. Their endurance is impressive, but it is not infinite. As you move on from walls and towers to the broader frontiers beyond them, you may find yourself thinking differently about strength, not as something fixed and imposing, but as something that must be renewed continuously, often invisibly. The silence of stone speaks not only of defense, but of waiting for help, for change, for a future that may or may not arrive. And with that thought, the focus shifts outward, toward the edges of the Crusader world, where fortifications were fewer, authority thinner, and survival even more uncertain, places like Edessa, where the limits of endurance would be tested first. Story 4. The County of Edessa, a fragile frontier. If you travel east from the coastal heartlands of the Crusader States, the land slowly changes. The air grows drier, the hills broader, the distances between settlements longer. The familiar lifeline of the Mediterranean fades behind you, replaced by roads that lead deeper into contested territory. This is Edessa, the first Crusader state to be established, and the first to reveal just how precarious the entire experiment truly is. Unlike Jerusalem, Antioch, or Tripoli, Edessa is landlocked. There are no ports, no fleets, no easy flow of reinforcements or supplies from Europe. Everything that sustains the county must travel overland, through territory that is often hostile or uncertain. From the moment it comes into being in 1098, Edessa exists on borrowed time, even if few are willing to admit it. You notice immediately how different the population is here. The majority are not Latin Christians, but Armenian Christians, along with Syriac Christians, Muslims, and others. The Armenians, in particular, have long experience living on frontiers, adapting to shifting rulers and surviving between larger powers. Their churches, customs, and language shape daily life far more than anything imported from Europe. Frankish rulers here are guests as much as lords, dependent on local alliances to function at all. Baldwin of Boulogne, who becomes Edessa's first ruler, does not conquer the county so much as insert himself into existing power structures. He marries into the Armenian elite, adopts local practices, and governs through cooperation as much as force. If you live in Edessa during these early years, you sense that authority is negotiated daily. Loyalty is personal, not institutional. What holds the county together is not law or infrastructure, but relationships. The city of Edessa itself is ancient, layered with history long predating the Crusades. Its walls have been rebuilt many times, its streets worn smooth by centuries of use. You walk past churches older than most European kingdoms, alongside mosques and markets that operate much as they always have. Life here does not pause for Crusader politics. It adapts quietly. Outside the city, control weakens quickly. Villages are scattered and vulnerable. Roads are long and difficult to secure. Garrisoning the countryside is nearly impossible with the manpower available. Castles exist, but they are fewer and more isolated than those in the west. Each one feels like an outpost rather than an anchor. When trouble comes, help is slow to arrive, if it arrives at all. Economically, Edessa survives on agriculture and regional trade, but both are fragile. Raids disrupt planting. Merchants avoid unsafe routes. A single bad year can strain the entire system. Taxes are collected carefully, often negotiated rather than enforced. The ruling class understands that pushing too hard risks collapse. This restraint keeps the county functioning, but it also limits its ability to prepare for larger threats. Militarily, Edessa is exposed on multiple fronts. To the north and east lie powerful Muslim states that are themselves divided but growing more coordinated over time. To the west, Antioch is a potential ally, but distance and politics complicate cooperation. You may hear promises of mutual defense, but in practice, each state prioritizes its own survival. Edessa's problems are often its own. Daily life reflects this uncertainty. People are alert but not constantly afraid. Raids are expected, not exceptional. Fields are planted with caution. Livestock is kept close. Travel is planned carefully, often postponed. You learn to read signs, unusual movements, missing traders, rumors carried by travelers. Information is as valuable as weapons here. Religious coexistence in Edessa feels older and more ingrained than in the western Crusader States. Communities have long experience negotiating space and authority. Frankish rulers fit into this pattern rather than reshaping it entirely. This creates a degree of stability, but it also means that the Crusader presence never fully defines the county's identity. Edessa is a frontier layered with identities, none of them absolute. As years pass, leadership changes expose structural weaknesses. Baldwin leaves to become king of Jerusalem. His successors are less adept, less connected to local elites. Personal bonds fray. Decisions made far away begin to matter more. You sense a shift from cautious adaptation to brittle confidence, as if the county's early survival has bred complacency. Warnings appear quietly. Enemy leaders consolidate power. Raids grow bolder. Alliances shift. Edessa's defenses remain thin, its manpower limited. Requests for aid are sent, but responses are slow or symbolic. Distance dulls urgency. For those living in the county, this delay is not abstract. It is measured in burned fields, lost villages, and shrinking margins of safety. And as you stand on the walls of Edessa, looking out over a landscape that offers little natural protection, you may begin to wonder whether this frontier state was ever meant to last, or whether its role was always to reveal, through its vulnerability, the limits of what the Crusader states could realistically defend. Life in Edessa is defined by adaptation. Unlike the fortified coastlines of Jerusalem or Antioch, Edessa offers no natural buffer against threat. The city itself sits on high ground, its walls formidable but finite. Beyond them, the landscape stretches for miles: open plains, rolling hills, and river valleys that are difficult to patrol. Every inhabitant quickly learns that survival depends on anticipation, cooperation, and careful use of limited resources. The Armenian population provides crucial continuity. Generations of frontier living have taught these communities how to weather raids, negotiate shifting allegiances, and manage scarce supplies. Farmers understand which soils recover fastest after fire, which wells dry first in summer, and which roads become impassable during winter rains. As a Frankish ruler or settler, you rely heavily on this knowledge. Your European experience helps with organizing knights or administering law, but it does not replace local expertise. Respect and cooperation become essential, even when pride or ideology resists it. Security shapes almost every aspect of life. Villagers maintain hidden caches of grain. Livestock is kept within enclosures at night or moved closer to fortified areas during periods of tension. Travelers learn the safest routes, but even these are imperfect. Raiders, sometimes opportunistic bands, Sometimes organized forces from neighboring states strike unpredictably. Fear is present, but it is managed pragmatically. You calculate losses, prepare contingencies, and hope experience keeps you one step ahead. Trade is fragile but vital. Caravan routes link Edessa to Aleppo, Antioch, and beyond, carrying grain, textiles, spices, and coins. Merchants operate cautiously. Some rely on local intermediaries to negotiate safe passage, paying tolls or tribute along the way. Markets in Edessa are less crowded than those on the coast, but they are still lively and vital for survival. Delays or disruptions have immediate consequences: hunger, unrest, and erosion of authority. The garrison system here is thin and overstretched. Castles dot the landscape, but they are few, small, and isolated. Garrison soldiers often serve multiple roles: patrolling, guarding, administering, and advising civilians. Training is ongoing, but numbers are limited. Reinforcements from Antioch or Jerusalem may arrive eventually, but not quickly enough to prevent localized crises. Survival here is as much about endurance as combat. Daily life adapts to these constraints. Farmers work close to settlements or fortified points, relying on early warning from scouts or messengers. Craftsmen and merchants adjust production to local needs, often improvising materials or tools. Religious practice continues, but it is intertwined with practical concerns: prayers for protection, offerings for harvest, and rituals designed to maintain cohesion rather than display dominance. Survival trumps ideology. Leadership in Edessa becomes a delicate exercise. The count must navigate relationships with Armenian elites, Latin knights, and neighboring powers simultaneously. Decisions often involve negotiation rather than decree. You learn quickly that arbitrary enforcement is dangerous. Pushing too hard risks revolt or desertion. Acting too weakly invites aggression. Authority is maintained by balance, attention, and personal diplomacy. Communication is challenging. Messages travel slowly, often days or weeks between settlements. Rumors abound, mixing truth with exaggeration. Strategic decisions are complicated by incomplete or outdated information. You rely on scouts, travelers, and local knowledge to fill the gaps, knowing that mistakes can be fatal. Even a small error misjudging the strength of a passing raiding party, underestimating the condition of a road, can ripple across months. Seasonal rhythms dominate life. Summers are dry and hot. Winters bring cold and occasional floods. Planting and harvesting are timed carefully to avoid disaster. During periods of high threat, you may abandon fields temporarily, accepting short-term loss to preserve manpower. Communities adapt continuously, finding ways to live within the margins rather than exceeding them. Despite these pressures, resilience emerges. Families and communities develop routines that balance risk with necessity. Scouts patrol predictably, while grain stores are hidden strategically. Water sources are protected and rationed. Villagers coordinate with the garrison in ways that are largely invisible to outsiders but critical to survival. Life is precarious, but it persists. Yet the underlying tension never disappears. The very factors that make Edessa habitable, local alliances, trade routes, and fortifications, also define its fragility. A shift in power among neighboring states, a leadership failure, or a particularly determined raid can disrupt this balance instantly. You live constantly aware that the county's endurance depends less on stone or weapons than on relationships, attention, and timing. As you walk along the city walls at dusk, observing the fields and villages beyond, you realize that Edessa is less a stronghold and more a test of human adaptation. Its survival depends on reading the land, understanding people, and responding quickly to threats that cannot be fully predicted. In this environment, ordinary decisions when to plant, how to ration, who to trust carry consequences as weighty as those made on the battlefield. And as night falls over Edessa, you may wonder whether this fragile frontier can hold under the pressure it will inevitably face, or whether the county is destined to show the limits of the Crusader experiment in ways that Jerusalem never will. By the mid-12th century, Edessa's precarious balance begins to fray. You sense it first in small ways: a delayed caravan, a missing messenger, a skirmish that spreads faster than expected. The county has survived through careful adaptation, local alliances, and constant vigilance, but those strategies are finite. Pressure builds from every direction: political, military, and logistical. For a region that has always existed on the margins, the tipping point arrives suddenly, almost inevitably. Edessa's population, though resilient, cannot fully compensate for the vulnerabilities of geography and isolation. Villages beyond the city walls remain lightly defended, relying on early warning systems and the hope that raiders will not strike twice. These hopes are increasingly unreliable. When attacks do occur, recovery is slow. Fields are burned, livestock scattered, and bridges destroyed. Each disruption erodes trust and undermines the authority of the county's rulers. You notice that ordinary people, the farmers, merchants, and artisans, bear the brunt of instability far more than soldiers or nobles. The county's military resources are stretched thin. Fortresses are scattered, garrisons small, and reinforcements from neighboring Crusader states slow to arrive. The Knights of Antioch or Jerusalem can dispatch help, but geography and politics limit response times. The county cannot rely on distant allies as it once could. Its survival becomes an exercise in improvisation and endurance. You see commanders making impossible choices: which village to defend, which supply line to reinforce, which route to abandon. Every decision carries immediate consequences. Diplomacy, once a primary tool for survival, begins to fail. Early agreements with Armenian nobles and neighboring Muslim leaders were fragile but effective. Over time, these relationships weaken through death, succession disputes, or shifting political alliances. Trust, painstakingly built over decades, erodes quickly. Without it, the county loses its most reliable defense: the cooperation of its people. You witness how fragile social bonds can be under stress, how reliance on personal authority becomes dangerous when leaders change or die. When the attack finally comes, it is not dramatic in the way a battle in Jerusalem might be imagined. There is no grand confrontation at dawn. Instead, it is a series of rapid losses. Outlying villages fall first, then smaller fortresses, until the capital itself is surrounded. Supplies dwindle. Scouts cannot penetrate the lines to report reinforcements. Morale collapses quietly as hope fades. Edessa's walls, formidable though they are, cannot substitute for manpower, planning, and external support. You see how even the strongest structures cannot hold without the human and logistical networks they depend upon. Collapse affects everyone, but in uneven ways. Nobles attempt to escape or negotiate surrender. Soldiers fight and fall. Civilians are displaced, moving toward other Crusader-held territories or returning to lands now controlled by rival powers. Families that once relied on careful routines and local knowledge now scatter. Memory preserves some of what was lost: the locations of fortresses, the routes of caravans, the identity of leaders, but the lived experience of daily life is shattered. Edessa's fall also teaches a broader lesson about the Crusader States as a whole. It reveals the limits of endurance for frontier territories. Territory can be won, fortified, and administered for years, even decades, but long-term survival is fragile when isolation, manpower, and supply lines cannot be sustained. You begin to understand that Edessa was a warning. The Crusader model could succeed in Jerusalem, with reinforcements from the sea and concentrated populations, but the edges were always vulnerable. Yet even as the county disappears from the political map, some aspects persist. Trade routes adapt to new rulers. Communities rebuild where possible. The memory of Frankish administration influences local governance and law for generations. The ruins of fortresses remain, telling a quiet story of effort, endurance, and limits. Stone outlasts the county, but human networks, the alliances, knowledge, and daily practices that sustained Edessa cannot be reconstructed once destroyed. The county's collapse forces reflection. For historians, planners, and participants alike, Edessa demonstrates that survival in the Holy Land depended as much on subtle, everyday choices as on victory in battle. It is a story of balance, adaptation, and human resilience, and of the sudden fragility that can undo even the most careful plans. For those who lived there, it is a story not of heroism alone, but of the endurance, strategy, and quiet suffering that underpinned every day. And as you leave Edessa behind, looking toward Antioch or the coast, you may find yourself asking, if the eastern frontier could fall despite careful planning, what does that imply for the survival of the entire Crusader experiment? How much of history depends not on strength, but on the ability to maintain fragile equilibrium against constant pressure? Story 5. Antioch, a city between powers. If you approach Antioch in the early 12th century, you notice immediately how different it feels from Edessa or Jerusalem. The city straddles rivers, hills, and plains, a natural hub of commerce and communication. From its walls, you can see roads stretching in every direction: north toward Aleppo, west toward the Mediterranean, south toward the interior of Syria. It is not just a city, it is a crossroads, a hinge on which the movements of armies, merchants, and pilgrims turn. Antioch's history predates the Crusaders by centuries. Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Arabs have all left their mark. Walls are thick, though patched and rebuilt repeatedly. Gates bear names in multiple languages, reflecting generations of rule and conquest. Inside, streets wind irregularly, blending the legacies of various empires. Markets operate with a rhythm that has survived long before any crusader set foot in the city. The city is layered with memory as well as stone. The Crusaders arrive in 1098 after a prolonged and exhausting siege, leaving a deep imprint. The city has changed hands violently, but the physical infrastructure remains resilient. Unlike Edessa, Antioch is well positioned geographically and economically. Its population is large and diverse. Greeks, Armenians, Syriacs, Muslims, Jews, and the new Latin settlers all live in proximity. You notice that social life is negotiated constantly, but in ways that are highly structured. Coexistence is less improvisation than strategy. Daily life in Antioch is dense and noisy. Markets bustle from dawn to dusk, merchants calling out wares in multiple languages. Goods arrive by caravan from the interior, by river, and by sea. Spices, textiles, grain, and wine circulate through narrow streets lined with shops, warehouses, and caravanserais. You quickly see that commerce is not merely trade, it is survival. The city depends on constant flow of food and goods, and interruptions are immediately felt. Military presence is constant. Crusader garrisons occupy key gates and towers, patrolling streets and overseeing access to markets. Soldiers maintain a careful balance. They enforce authority while avoiding excessive interference in commerce and civic life. Their role is both practical and symbolic. Citizens are reminded of who rules, yet the city's economic vitality must continue. You observe that the success of governance depends as much on maintaining everyday life as on projecting force. Walls and fortifications dominate the skyline. Antioch's castle, perched on high ground overlooking the city, is a fortress within a fortress. It is a place of command, storage, and observation. From here, leaders monitor movements in every direction. The castle is not merely defensive, it is a center of administration, a hub for planning, negotiation, and diplomacy. Orders flow outward, reinforcing the fragile networks that sustain the city. Population dynamics are complex. Latin settlers are a minority but politically dominant. Their authority is mediated through alliances with local elites, agreements with merchants, and the visible presence of military force. Religious communities maintain their own institutions and courts, often negotiating disputes internally. Coexistence is pragmatic. You learn quickly that rigid enforcement of ideology is less important than ensuring trade continues. Taxes are collected, and unrest is minimized. Supply and logistics are constant concerns. Antioch is rich compared to frontier territories, but it is never self-sufficient. Grain, water, and materials must be managed carefully. The city relies on a network of surrounding villages, rivers, and roads. Any disruption, drought, raid, or political instability threatens both survival and authority. You notice how administrators track resources meticulously, understanding that even small miscalculations can ripple outward. Relations with surrounding powers define much of life. To the east lie Muslim-controlled territories with which Antioch must negotiate, sometimes through trade, sometimes through intimidation or tribute. To the west, the Mediterranean provides potential reinforcements and maritime trade, but only if relationships with Italian and other European merchants remain favorable. The city functions as a hinge, sensitive to pressure on every side. A failure in diplomacy or logistics can destabilize life before any army arrives. Every day is shaped by tension. Threats are rarely immediate, but they are ever present. You see it in watch rotations, in the careful storage of grain, in the cautious negotiation of trade routes. Citizens develop habits of awareness, noting unusual movements, paying attention to rumors, and preparing quietly for disruption. Life is not heroic, it is deliberate. Small choices, who to trust, where to travel, how to store supplies, carry weight. And as night falls over Antioch, the city quiets unevenly. Gates close, lamps are lit, and soldiers patrol walls. Markets empty gradually. People retreat to homes and courtyards, aware that the next day will demand the same vigilance, care, and negotiation. From the castle, the city looks stable, almost permanent. Yet beneath that calm, you may wonder how long this balance can last, given the forces pressing from every direction. The city's survival is contingent, its security provisional, and its prosperity dependent on constant attention. Living in Antioch is a constant exercise in awareness. The city's impressive walls and towering fortifications give the appearance of safety, but you quickly realize that survival depends as much on understanding human behavior and political nuance as it does on stone. Every market, every street, every interaction carries subtle signs, some signaling opportunity, others warning of danger. You learn to read them because you must. Commerce is central to daily life, and it is everywhere. Merchants from Italy, Syria, Armenia, and beyond fill narrow streets with carts and donkeys carrying goods. Grain, cloth, wine, and spices flow through the city, sustaining residents and armies alike. Prices fluctuate according to season, supply, and rumor. Even a small disruption, delayed shipment, bandit raid, or spike in taxation affects the entire urban economy. You notice that merchants are cautious, yet persistent. Their resilience underpins the city's stability. Security is both visible and invisible. Soldiers patrol the walls and gates, but much of the real defense comes from human networks. Scouts and informants monitor the surrounding countryside. Local leaders maintain watch over neighborhoods. Intelligence is passed quietly between garrison commanders and civic officials. You quickly learn that walls protect against direct assault, but information protects against surprise and panic. In Antioch, knowing is as important as fighting. Everyday life is layered with routines designed to minimize risk. Farmers bring goods into the city at set times. Travelers adhere to established routes, guided by locals who know which roads are safe. Water and food supplies are monitored constantly, stored in ways that account for both scarcity and siege. Even religious observances are subtly adapted to reflect practicality. Processions are timed to avoid congested streets. Pilgrim movements are coordinated with market schedules. You notice that ritual and survival are intertwined. Latins, the ruling minority, exercise authority carefully. Nobles and knights enforce law and order, collect taxes, and maintain garrisons, but they rely on cooperation from local elites. Armenians, Greeks, Syriacs, and Muslims continue to operate within their own communities, maintaining courts, schools, and marketplaces. This coexistence is pragmatic. Enforcement is selective. Punishment is often tempered by the practical need to maintain trade, labor, and loyalty. You recognize that governance in Antioch is more about negotiation than force. The city's geography shapes daily movement. The Orontes River provides both a lifeline and a vulnerability, supplying water while offering potential access to enemies. Hills, valleys, and gates divide neighborhoods, creating zones of relative safety and areas that require vigilance. Streets twist and wind, limiting line of sight but offering concealment. You understand quickly that knowledge of terrain is a daily necessity, not a luxury. Threats are never constant, but they are omnipresent. Raids from surrounding Muslim territories are periodic, sometimes small and opportunistic, sometimes larger and coordinated. Rival Latin lords may assert claims, creating internal tension. Diplomacy is as much a survival strategy as weaponry. Treaties, marriages, and temporary truces are tools of daily life. Citizens, soldiers, and administrators alike adjust behavior to accommodate these shifting realities. Social life is governed by hierarchy and interdependence. Nobles wield authority, but ordinary people exercise influence through networks of trust and obligation. Craftsmen, merchants, and local leaders negotiate access, resources, and protection. Children grow up observing these patterns, learning how to navigate authority and risk simultaneously. You notice that skill in negotiation is as valued as strength in battle. Military preparedness is an ongoing routine. Drills are regular but restrained, focused on efficiency and endurance. Supplies are counted and rationed. Watch schedules are strict. Every individual from knight to servant understands their role in the maintenance of security. Even minor mistakes can have consequences. You sense that discipline is both practical and psychological. It instills confidence, reinforces order, and mitigates panic when threats arise. Despite this careful order, uncertainty never disappears. Alliances can shift overnight. Weather can devastate crops. Disease can spread quickly through dense neighborhoods. Each day requires small calculations, decisions, and adjustments. Survival depends on observation, prudence, and adaptability more than heroism. You begin to see that life in Antioch is defined by the capacity to endure not by grand events, but by the countless small acts of awareness and caution that keep the city functioning. As night falls over Antioch, the streets quiet unevenly. Lamps flicker in doorways. Guards patrol the walls. Families retire to homes or inner courtyards. Even in apparent calm, you sense the underlying tension, the fragile balance that sustains life here. From the castle, the city appears secure, but security is provisional, contingent on human skill, cooperation, and vigilance. And as you stand quietly, listening to the faint murmur of markets and the distant call of a watchman, you may wonder, how long can such a city maintain balance when pressure comes not just from enemies outside the walls, but from the complexity of managing life within them? When does vigilance strain into exhaustion and caution slip into vulnerability? Over time, the fragile equilibrium of Antioch is tested repeatedly. Unlike Edessa, which eventually collapses under isolation and relentless external pressure, Antioch's survival depends on the combination of fortifications, commerce, diplomacy, and sheer human adaptability. Yet crises arrive inevitably, in forms both sudden and drawn out. Raiding parties, political intrigue, famine, disease, and the looming threat of larger armies. You quickly realize that life here is a cycle of preparation, vigilance, and adaptation, punctuated by moments of acute danger. When a siege begins, the city's routines transform. Market activity slows dramatically, then ceases. Supplies are rationed rigorously. The garrison reinforces gates and walls. Civilians move livestock and valuables into safer areas within the fortifications. Every action is carefully timed and coordinated. You notice how years of careful planning manifest in small, almost invisible details. Hidden food caches, secret water cisterns, and prearranged signaling systems with distant allies. The walls themselves are impressive, but the real defense is human ingenuity and foresight. The psychological strain is relentless. Fear and uncertainty pervade daily life, but it is managed. Guards remain disciplined. Soldiers carry out duties with precision. Civilians adapt quietly, focusing on tasks they can control. Children and the elderly are sheltered as best as possible. Rumors and misinformation circulate, adding tension, but experienced leaders and local knowledge mitigate panic. You begin to see that survival in Antioch is as much about mental endurance as physical preparedness. Supply lines are the city's lifeblood. Even a prolonged siege can be endured if provisions are managed carefully. Grain and water are monitored, distributed methodically, and conserved for emergencies. Trade caravans, when they arrive, are scrutinized and redirected efficiently. Every ounce of food, every drop of water, is accounted for. The logistics of survival dictate behavior as much as walls or weapons do. Military strategy during a siege is layered. Defenders rely on high walls, towers, and narrow gates to slow attackers. Archers, crossbowmen, and melee troops operate in shifts, preserving stamina. Engineers reinforce weak points, maintain gates, and repair damage from minor assaults. Even small actions, filling a trench, repairing a breach, maintaining signaling systems, become critical. You notice that victories are rarely decisive. Instead, survival is measured in delay, attrition, and endurance. Civilians continue their roles despite danger. Artisans repair tools, blacksmiths maintain weapons, cooks ration food, and merchants adjust trading behavior within limitations. Cooperation between military and civilian populations is essential. Everyone is dependent on everyone else, and discipline is enforced by necessity more than authority. The city's survival is a collective achievement, not merely a product of walls and soldiers. Diplomacy continues alongside defense. Messages are sent to allies in Jerusalem, Tripoli, and European powers. Negotiations with surrounding Muslim states sometimes occur, seeking temporary truces, safe passage, or trade allowances. Antioch's leaders understand that isolation is deadly. You observe how survival is not simply a matter of resisting attack. It is about maintaining relationships, anticipating pressure, and leveraging connections across political and cultural boundaries. Disease and hunger are persistent secondary threats. Sieges, even when managed competently, strain health. Malnutrition weakens defenders. Poor sanitation spreads illness. Leaders balance the risk of rationing against the risk of unrest. Survival here is an exercise in constant calculation: how much to conserve, when to expend, and how to keep morale sufficient for endurance. When the siege ends, whether through relief, negotiation, or the attacker's withdrawal, the city does not immediately return to normal. Streets are repaired, supplies replenished, walls reinforced. Lessons are recorded in practice and memory rather than in formal chronicle. Individuals remember both successes and failures, passing knowledge to the next generation. Antioch's resilience is cumulative, built over decades of careful adaptation and trial. The long-term lesson of Antioch is subtle but significant. Unlike Edessa, which succumbed to isolation, Antioch survives because it integrates multiple strategies: strong fortifications, trade, diplomacy, local knowledge, and constant vigilance. Its endurance is not heroic or grandiose. It is mundane, painstaking, and continuous. Success is measured in years of survival rather than decisive victory. You realize that the city's story is one of sustained adaptation under pressure, where small, quiet decisions outweigh the boldness of armies. As you stand on the walls at dusk, observing the city stretching outward toward the surrounding hills and rivers, you may reflect on the paradox of Antioch. Its position at the crossroads of commerce, politics, and culture gives it strength and vulnerability in equal measure. The city survives, not because danger is absent, but because its inhabitants understand the limits of control, the necessity of cooperation, and the quiet power of endurance. And as night settles over the city, the walls holding fast against both human and natural threats, you may wonder how much of history depends not on conquests, battles, or kings, but on the daily, measured acts of survival, negotiation, and adaptation that allow life to continue, quietly, against the odds. Story 6. Tripoli Commerce and Coastal Defense. If you follow the coast north from Tyre and south from Antioch, the land begins to flatten, forming valleys that open onto the Mediterranean. Here lies Tripoli, a city of both opportunity and exposure. Unlike Edessa's frontier or Antioch's crossroads, Tripoli's survival depends on the sea as much as on the land. Control of the harbor, access to trade, and the ability to receive reinforcements by ship define daily life in ways invisible to most inland observers. Tripoli's founding as a Crusader state in 1109 is a slow process. The city is fortified gradually, with both imported European techniques and adaptations learned from local Levantan practices. Its walls are impressive, but less imposing than Antioch's, relying on coastal cliffs and natural harbors to enhance defense. You notice immediately that the city's layout reflects dual priorities: defense and trade. Streets run toward the harbor, warehouses cluster near docks, and markets occupy areas both inside and just outside the walls. Every stone has a purpose. The city thrives on commerce. Italian maritime powers Venice, Genoa, Pisa dominate trade, bringing goods, men, and influence. Merchants from Syria, North Africa, and beyond converge here, negotiating passage, paying tolls, and storing wares. Grain, timber, olive oil, wine, and textiles flow steadily, sustaining both the local population and the military garrison. For residents, daily life revolves around these exchanges. Prices fluctuate based on winds, piracy, and political agreements. You see that success in Tripoli depends as much on economic acumen as on military strength. Defense is ever present. The city's walls are reinforced with towers and the harbor is monitored constantly. Ships bring both commerce and the threat of attack. Sea raids are rare but feared. Inland raids along the coastal plains are more common. Patrols are routine, and watchmen line the harbor and walls day and night. Civilians internalize this vigilance. Children learn to recognize signaling fires. Merchants adjust their schedules to avoid risk. Even social gatherings are timed with awareness of potential threats. Life in Tripoli is cosmopolitan yet hierarchical. Latin settlers, merchants, and the military elite dominate political authority, but local populations, Arabs, Syriacs, and other Christians maintain their own religious and social structures. Cooperation is necessary for survival, but it is often fragile. Negotiation is constant. Over taxes, trade rights, harbor access, and legal jurisdiction. You notice that stability is provisional, maintained less by force than by the careful balancing of competing interests. Water management and food supply are vital. The city relies on cisterns, wells, and nearby agricultural villages. Rainwater is captured and stored meticulously. Grain is imported and stockpiled to sustain residents during sieges or poor harvests. Even minor disruptions, storm damage to docks, a delayed shipment, or a localized raid can create anxiety. Residents learn to adapt, ration, and improvise, knowing that survival is a function of careful attention rather than heroic intervention. Tripoli's political environment is fluid. The city maintains cautious relations with neighboring Muslim territories, paying tribute at times, negotiating truces at others. Alliances with other Crusader states are vital but always conditional. Requests for assistance by sea may be delayed by storms or political conflicts elsewhere. You see that authority here is contingent, not absolute. Power is exercised through diplomacy, negotiation, and selective enforcement, as much as through walls and soldiers. The harbor itself is a center of life and concern. Ships arriving and departing dictate rhythm. Fishermen, sailors, and dockworkers perform their labor under scrutiny, balancing commerce and security. Ship maintenance, loading, and unloading are constant activities, structured to maximize efficiency and minimize exposure to threat. Even the tides seem to influence social and economic patterns. You notice how every action is interconnected. Harbor activity, defense readiness, taxation, and supply chains all depend on one another. Religious practice persists alongside commerce and defense. Churches, chapels, and small monasteries serve local populations, pilgrims, and merchants. Rituals are regular, but often adapted to practical concerns. Festivals coincide with market cycles, processions are routed to avoid congestion, and charitable giving is timed to reinforce both piety and social cohesion. You notice that spiritual life is intertwined with the rhythms of survival, a silent layer supporting daily existence. Yet despite careful planning, you sense the fragility of Tripoli. The city is exposed to both land and sea, dependent on trade networks and alliances that can shift overnight. Storms, piracy, political instability, or raids can disrupt routines instantly. Life is defined not by what is permanent, but by what can be maintained continuously, day by day, under vigilance and adaptation. And as the sun sets over the harbor, casting long shadows over warehouses and battlements, you may reflect on Tripoli's delicate balance, a city that survives through the quiet coordination of commerce, diplomacy, and defense, constantly negotiating its place between opportunity and exposure, prosperity and peril. Inside Tripoli's walls, life hums with constant, structured activity. The city's appearance suggests strength. Stone battlements, towers, and gates dominate the skyline, but real security depends on rhythm, routine, and the quiet discipline of thousands of daily decisions. Residents have learned to navigate the interplay between commerce, defense, and community, a delicate balance that defines every moment. The harbor is the city's pulse. Merchants arrive from Italy, North Africa, and the Levant, bringing goods, news, and manpower. You notice that arrival times are carefully timed. The flow of ships must match the capacity of docks and warehouses. Dockworkers, sailors, and merchants coordinate closely, moving cargo with efficiency, but always mindful of potential threats from sea raiders or storms. Even minor delays ripple across the city, affecting prices, provisions, and morale. The rhythm of trade becomes a measure of survival. Markets within the walls are similarly structured. Grain, olive oil, wine, spices, textiles, and tools circulate daily. Vendors call out their goods, but the transactions are cautious and calculated. Prices fluctuate according to supply, weather, and rumors of conflict. Citizens adapt their purchasing to available resources, conserving what they can and prioritizing essentials. You see that commerce is not simply exchange. It is a strategy for endurance, ensuring that both households and garrisons can survive potential disruptions. Defense is omnipresent but rarely dramatic. Guards patrol the walls, towers, and gates, rotating shifts to maintain vigilance without exhausting personnel. Scouts monitor the surrounding countryside for signs of raiding parties. Watchmen line the harbor, signaling with flags, horns, or fires. Even daily tasks fetching water, transporting goods, or moving livestock require consideration of security. You notice that in Tripoli, survival is achieved through constant awareness, not sudden acts of heroism. Social organization is layered and negotiated. Latin nobles and military leaders hold formal authority, but power is exercised through cooperation with local populations: Arabs, Armenians, Syriacs, and other Christian communities. These groups maintain their own religious, legal, and social systems. Disputes are settled through negotiation, mediation, or selective enforcement of laws. You observe that stability is provisional. It depends on a network of trust, compliance, and shared interest rather than coercion alone. Food and water are managed meticulously. Cisternal storage captures rainwater. Wells are maintained. Grain is stockpiled for both the population and garrison. Supplies are monitored daily. During shortages or sieges, rationing is implemented quietly, with distribution controlled to maintain order. You notice how small decisions allocating a few bushels of grain, conserving water during a dry spell can determine the well-being of hundreds. Survival is measured in careful calculation, rather than grand gestures. Religion and daily life are intertwined. Churches, chapels, and monasteries serve multiple functions: spiritual centers, places of refuge, and nodes of social cohesion. Processions and festivals are coordinated to avoid interference with markets and defense activities. Priests and monks participate in logistics, offering guidance, mediating disputes, and sometimes providing labor for repairs or fortification maintenance. You begin to see how spiritual life is integrated into the practical mechanics of survival. Communication is vital and constant. Messengers carry news and instructions between the city and nearby settlements or other Crusader states. Delays can have immediate consequences. Missed reinforcements, disrupted trade, or uncoordinated defenses. Citizens and leaders alike develop keen awareness of timing, patterns, and trustworthiness of information. You see that knowledge flows as much through observation and habit as through formal channels. Despite careful organization, tension is ever present. Storms can damage docks and infrastructure. Raiders strike intermittently. Political alliances shift unpredictably. Each threat requires a response that is immediate yet measured, balancing risk and opportunity. Residents adapt continuously, modifying routines and expectations, learning which vulnerabilities can be tolerated and which must be addressed immediately. Life is less about domination and more about resilience. As dusk falls, the city quiets unevenly. Torches flicker along the harbor and walls. Soldiers patrol in structured rotations. Merchants count goods and reconcile accounts. Families move indoors, observing routines honed over years. Even as the city appears calm, the underlying rhythm of vigilance continues. You recognize that survival is not static. It is a continuous collective act, reliant on coordination, discipline, and foresight. And as the Mediterranean wind sweeps across the harbor, stirring the masts of ships and the banners of towers, you may reflect on the delicate balance that defines Tripoli. Its strength lies not in heroic battles, but in the quiet coordination of trade, defense, and daily life, a fragile equilibrium constantly negotiated between opportunity and threat. Tripoli's life is a continuous negotiation between prosperity and peril, and that negotiation is tested repeatedly. Unlike inland cities such as Edessa, Tripoli is exposed not only to land-based threats, but also to the unpredictability of the sea. Raiding parties, rival powers, and storms test the city's defenses, and every crisis, whether minor or severe, demands coordinated action across civilian and military spheres. You quickly realize that survival here is as much about timing, observation, and calculation as it is about walls or swords. When a siege occurs, the city shifts into heightened mode almost imperceptibly. Market activity slows first, then ceases. Ships in the harbor are secured, supplies are redistributed, and livestock is moved within fortified areas. Watch rotations intensify. Scouts report any unusual movement beyond the walls. Even small tasks carrying water, repairing fortifications, or moving trade goods are executed with careful attention to timing and risk. Survival depends on cumulative discipline, not singular heroics. Logistics dictate the rhythm of endurance. Grain, wine, water, and other essentials are counted and monitored. Rationing is applied judiciously. Even the perception of scarcity is managed to prevent panic. You notice that administrators rely on a combination of observation, experience, and local knowledge to maintain equilibrium. One misstep, a miscalculated ration, a delayed shipment, or overlooked damage to the harbor can ripple through the population, affecting morale, health, and the city's defensive capacity. Military strategy during crises is deliberate. The city's walls and towers provide strong points, but the real defense is the integration of soldiers, citizens, and infrastructure. Archers and crossbowmen take positions along predictable rotations. Gates are reinforced and guarded meticulously. Engineers repair breaches quickly, sometimes under the pressure of active attacks. Every action filling trenches, distributing supplies, signaling allies is coordinated, emphasizing precision over flamboyance. Daily life continues, even in tension. Artisans repair tools and weapons. Merchants adjust inventory. Cooks ration food carefully. Civilians cooperate with garrison forces, following routines that balance safety, efficiency, and community needs. You see that survival is a collective process. Walls protect only as long as the people inside know how to maintain them and how to manage resources wisely. Diplomacy remains active even under siege. Messages are sent to neighboring Crusader states and maritime allies in Europe. Temporary truces, negotiations for safe passage, or agreements for trade support are pursued as part of strategic survival. Antioch, Jerusalem, and European maritime powers all influence outcomes, but response is rarely immediate. The city's leadership must plan for delays and contingencies, integrating local knowledge and long-term foresight. Disease and hunger are persistent secondary threats. Even when external attacks are repelled, prolonged stress on resources can weaken the population. Malnutrition, illness, and exhaustion threaten soldiers and civilians alike. Leaders manage these pressures with rationing, strategic rest, and careful allocation of labor. You notice how survival requires constant adjustment, with small, deliberate decisions making the difference between endurance and collapse. Once the immediate crisis passes, recovery is gradual. Streets are repaired, warehouses restocked, walls reinforced. Lessons are embedded in practice, not always in formal records. Citizens remember strategies that worked and those that failed. Engineers, merchants, and leaders pass this knowledge to the next generation. The city's resilience accumulates incrementally, a product of both human skill and institutional memory. Tripoli's survival demonstrates that coastal and commercial cities rely on balance more than brute force. Unlike Edessa, which fell due to isolation, or Antioch, which endured through strategic position and adaptability, Tripoli endures because of continuous coordination across multiple dimensions: defense, trade, diplomacy, and community. Its strength is quiet, cumulative, and often invisible. As you stand atop the walls at dusk, watching ships rock gently in the harbor and the last market stalls closing along the quays, you may reflect on Tripoli's paradox. Prosperity and vulnerability coexist constantly, and the city's continued existence depends not on overwhelming force but on careful, measured management of countless small risks. Strength here is quiet, cumulative, and fragile, a lesson about how history is shaped not just by battles, but by the steady rhythm of human ingenuity, adaptation, and endurance. Story 7. The Principality of Galilee. Life on a rural Crusader frontier. Travel inland from the coast near Acre, and you enter the rolling hills and fertile plains of Galilee. The landscape here is deceptively calm. Olive groves, vineyards, and small villages suggest peace, but for the Crusaders, this rural frontier is a constant challenge. Unlike cities such as Tripoli or Antioch, Galilee relies less on walls and more on dispersed settlements, fortified farms, and the daily vigilance of local communities. Life is slower paced than in the coastal or crossroads cities, but no less defined by the need for careful planning and endurance. The Principality of Galilee is established shortly after the First Crusade, with Tancred initially appointed as ruler, followed by a series of counts who navigate a delicate balance between local populations, neighboring Muslim lords, and other Crusader states. Authority is personal, exercised through negotiation, alliances, and the occasional show of force. Castles exist, but they are scattered, small, and never sufficient to cover the entire territory. You notice immediately that survival here depends as much on the behavior of people as on the strength of stone. Villages are dispersed across valleys and hills. Farmers work land that has been cultivated for generations, growing wheat, barley, olives, and grapes. Livestock grazes along hillsides, but herds are often moved closer to fortified points when danger threatens. Daily routines are synchronized with the rhythms of both nature and politics. Fields are planted according to rainfall patterns. Harvests are timed to avoid conflict. Water sources are guarded. Even the smallest farm reflects strategic decisions aimed at survival. Life in Galilee is defined by practical cooperation. Latin settlers, local Christians, and remaining Muslim communities coexist in ways that are often pragmatic rather than ideological. Taxes are negotiated. Local leaders mediate disputes, Garrisons coordinate with villagers to patrol roads and monitor surrounding terrain. You notice that authority is fluid. The Count exercises power not through constant presence, but by ensuring networks of loyalty, communication, and obligation function reliably. Security is decentralized. Small fortresses and towers are scattered across the hills, providing refuge and observation points. Local militias supplement garrisons, and villagers learn to recognize early signs of raids. Scouting is routine. You see that strategy in Galilee is about anticipation, understanding the land, the people, and the potential movements of enemy forces. Battles are rare. Preparation, observation, and adaptability are constant. Trade and sustenance are intertwined. Villages produce food for local consumption and for supply to larger Crusader cities like Acre and Tyre. Caravans travel along risky routes to deliver surplus, subject to raids and disruption. Merchants, farmers, and garrisons develop informal signaling systems to manage movement, relying on experience rather than formal infrastructure. You notice how survival here is deeply relational. Knowing your neighbors, allies, and even distant traders can determine whether a season succeeds or fails. Water management is critical. Streams, wells, and cisterns must be maintained to support both people and livestock. During dry seasons, access is carefully regulated. Crop rotation and soil management are practiced with long-term survival in mind. You see that sustainability is embedded in daily routines. Nothing can be wasted, everything has a purpose, and foresight is as valuable as strength. Military life is present but understated. Knights stationed at castles conduct patrols, train local forces, and coordinate with neighbors. Full-scale battles are rare, but raids and skirmishes are frequent enough to shape behavior. You notice that much of military training focuses on endurance, communication, and improvisation. Soldiers learn to move across terrain efficiently, to anticipate threats, and to conserve resources. Success is measured in avoiding disaster rather than achieving glory. Religion remains central, but integrated with daily survival. Churches and monasteries serve as spiritual centers, community hubs, and sometimes storage or shelter in emergencies. Religious festivals are scheduled around agricultural and security needs. Priests advise on social disputes, coordinate relief efforts, and help enforce moral and practical norms. Faith supports endurance as much as piety, providing a framework for both communal cohesion and individual discipline. Even in calm periods, Galilee is defined by anticipation. Villagers watch for distant smoke, unusual troop movements, or disrupted trade. You notice that the quiet hills conceal constant vigilance. Every action, planting, tending animals, traveling to markets, is informed by a subtle awareness of what might go wrong. Survival here is quiet, measured, and continuous. And as the sun sets over olive groves and rolling hills, casting shadows across scattered villages and fortified towers, you may reflect on the unique rhythm of Galilee, a frontier that survives not through grandeur, but through the careful coordination of people, resources, and attention, day by day, season by season. In Galilee, survival is not achieved by grand battles or imposing castles alone. Instead, it is the cumulative result of countless small decisions, made daily by knights, villagers, and local leaders alike. Every household, farm, and fortified tower participates in a larger network of awareness, communication, and adaptation that stretches across hills, valleys, and rivers. You begin to understand that in such a frontier, endurance is as much a skill as courage. Villagers and local militias develop routines that balance work and vigilance. Farmers tend crops but also observe roads for suspicious movement. Shepherds patrol hillsides while keeping livestock safe. Women and men coordinate with garrisons to ensure communication lines remain open. You notice that even leisure or religious activity is structured around survival. Processions, gatherings, and market days are timed to avoid conflict or exposure. The ordinary rhythms of life are deeply informed by threat. Castles and towers act as nodes in this network rather than as centralized power. Small garrisons maintain watch, signaling potential danger through horns, fires, or messengers. A threatened village can alert neighbors, who respond with armed volunteers or reinforcements from the nearest stronghold. You see that the success of this system relies on trust, discipline, and shared understanding. Walls provide safety, but people provide the mechanism to use them effectively. Trade and supply are equally delicate. Local villages exchange surplus grain, wine, olive oil, and livestock with other settlements or coastal cities like Acre. Caravans traverse difficult terrain, often under escort but subject to delay, theft, or ambush. You observe how merchants and farmers negotiate timing, routes, and alliances constantly, adjusting plans based on weather, political developments, and intelligence. Economic survival is inseparable from security. Leadership in Galilee is decentralized and pragmatic. Counts cannot be everywhere at once. Their authority rests on coordination with local lords, Armenian and Syriac leaders, and the Latin military presence. Decisions are negotiated. Who maintains a road, who reinforces a tower, how much grain is allocated for defense versus consumption. You notice that effective governance in the principality is less about issuing orders than about creating reliable networks that function even when leaders are absent. Water and food management are vital to both daily life and emergency planning. Cisterns, wells, and streams must be protected and monitored. Grain and other stores are rationed carefully, with surplus kept in multiple locations to prevent total loss from raid or fire. Farmers and garrison members cooperate to move livestock to safety in anticipation of attack. You notice that foresight and redundancy are more important than any single stronghold. Military activity is understated but constant. Knights patrol roads, train local militias, and maintain fortifications. Skirmishes and raids occur frequently, often small but impactful. Training emphasizes endurance, observation, and improvisation. Soldiers must move quickly, communicate efficiently, and adapt to conditions in terrain they know intimately. You begin to see that in Galilee, strategy is as much about avoiding engagement at the wrong time as it is about winning battle. The landscape itself dictates human behavior. Hills, rivers, and valleys provide both opportunity and vulnerability. Villagers build near water sources but avoid lowlands prone to flooding or enemy encroachment. Watchpoints are chosen for visibility rather than convenience. Even the routes to market are planned with terrain and potential danger in mind. Survival is spatial as much as it is social or logistical. Religion continues to shape everyday life, providing cohesion, guidance, and moral framework. Churches and monasteries serve as centers for education, dispute resolution, and storage. Rituals reinforce social bonds and discipline. Priests and monks advise on both spiritual and practical matters, often helping to coordinate relief during crises. Faith in Galilee is embedded in the material rhythms of life, rather than existing apart from them. Despite careful management, tension is constant. Each season brings new threats: raiding parties, neighboring political shifts, droughts, or disease. Villagers and garrisons adapt continuously, modifying routines, reassigning labor, and conserving resources. You notice that life here is defined by anticipation, continuous awareness of what could go wrong, and constant preparation to mitigate those risks. As the sun sets across the hills, casting long shadows over olive groves and terraced fields, you sense the quiet resilience of the principality. Galilee survives not through dramatic heroism or imposing fortresses, but through the disciplined coordination of its people, careful planning, and relentless vigilance. Everyday choices: where to plant, when to travel, whom to trust, determine survival as much as swords and walls. And as you walk along a ridge, watching the smoke rising from distant villages and the glint of a distant tower, you may wonder, how long can such a fragile, human-dependent network endure under pressure before a single failure, a misread warning, a lost supply, a delayed reinforcement cascades into crisis? Over time, the Principality of Galilee faces the reality that its survival is never guaranteed. Unlike cities such as Tripoli or Antioch, which can rely on fortifications, trade, and coastal access, Galilee's endurance depends almost entirely on its networks of vigilance, cooperation, and careful resource management. You quickly realize that this is a frontier governed not by overwhelming force, but by the quiet labor of preparation, communication, and adaptability. Raids arrive periodically, testing the resilience of villages, fortresses, and supply routes. Some are small, opportunistic incursions by neighboring powers or bandit groups. Others are larger, coordinated attacks seeking to destabilize the principality. You observe that the impact of these raids is uneven. A poorly defended farm may be destroyed, a bridge burned, or a caravan intercepted. Each incident forces immediate decision-making, careful rationing, and sometimes evacuation. Survival is a constant negotiation of risk versus necessity. Castles and towers serve as both refuge and coordination hubs. Their walls are strong, but manpower is limited. Garrison knights rotate patrols, coordinate with local militias, and maintain communication with neighboring strongholds. Signaling systems, horns, fires, and messengers transmit alerts over miles. You notice that a single failure in communication can leave villages exposed for days, highlighting how dependent the principality is on continuous human coordination. Leadership in Galilee is tested repeatedly. Counts and lords must balance competing priorities, reinforcing vulnerable points, mediating disputes among local communities, collecting and allocating resources, and maintaining alliances with other Crusader states. Authority is less a matter of command than of trust. Villagers follow orders when they believe in the competence, fairness, and foresight of those issuing them. You see that governance here is fragile, contingent on perception and personal relationships as much as on law or military strength. Resource management is central to survival. Grain, livestock, water, and tools are carefully monitored and stored in multiple locations to minimize total loss. Crops are rotated and fields fallowed strategically to prevent depletion. Livestock is herded based on both pasture availability and security. Even minor miscalculations, a delayed harvest, an overlooked cistern, or misallocated grain can have consequences that ripple across months or years. You notice that endurance in Galilee is cumulative. Each season builds on the successes or failures of the last. Daily life continues under pressure. Villagers tend crops, prepare food, maintain homes, and educate children, all while remaining alert to threats. Militia training, patrols, and scout reports form part of the rhythm of life. Trade continues cautiously, with caravans moving along planned routes, timed to avoid both raiders and conflict zones. Even religious activities are informed by practical constraints. Festivals are scheduled to minimize disruption. Churches coordinate relief during emergencies, and clergy participate in both spiritual and logistical life. Survival and faith are inseparable. The landscape itself enforces awareness. Hills, valleys, rivers, and roads dictate the flow of people, supplies, and information. Strategic points are fortified, but many remain exposed. You notice how intimately residents understand their environment, which paths are safest, which streams are most reliable, which hills provide early warning. Knowledge of terrain is as critical as knowledge of allies or enemies. Tension is a constant companion. Drought, disease, raiding parties, and political shifts each pose threats that require adaptation. Villagers, soldiers, and leaders learn to anticipate, respond, and recover. Even minor mistakes, a misread warning, a mismanaged harvest, or delayed reinforcements can escalate into serious consequences. The margin for error is small, but the inhabitants of Galilee persist. And yet, even amid fragility, endurance emerges. The principality survives because its people understand the limits of control. They cannot prevent every threat, but they can prepare, coordinate, and adapt. Its story is not one of dramatic conquests, but of measured resilience. Ordinary acts, maintaining fields, repairing walls, managing supplies, patrolling roads, accumulate into long-term survival. you see that history is often shaped less by battles than by the quiet, disciplined choices of daily life. As the sun sets over Galilee's rolling hills and scattered villages, casting shadows across olive groves, rivers, and fortified towers, you may reflect on the subtle lesson of this frontier. Survival depends not on absolute power, but on continuous adaptation, human networks, and the willingness to endure uncertainty. In the rural crucible of the Holy Land, life is both fragile and remarkably persistent, a testament to human resilience against constant pressure. Story 8. The County of Jaffa and Ascalon Coastal Administration and Daily Life. Travel south along the Mediterranean from Acre, and you enter the counties of Jaffa and Ascalon. Here, the land meets the sea in a series of small ports, beaches, and plains, punctuated by fortresses overlooking key routes. Unlike Edessa or Galilee, this region relies heavily on its coastal position. Trade, communication, and reinforcements arrive primarily by sea, while inland threats loom constantly, pressing the population to adapt in subtle ways. Life is defined by movement, observation, and careful management of both people and resources. Jaffa serves as the primary gateway to the Holy Land for pilgrims and merchants. Ships arrive from Europe laden with goods, soldiers, and clerics. The port is a hive of activity, and the rhythm of the city is dictated by tides, trade schedules, and seasonal pilgrimages. You notice immediately that control of the harbor is not just economic, it is strategic. Whoever dominates Jaffa controls the flow of people and supplies into the southern Crusader States. Fortifications are carefully planned. Jaffa and Ascalon each boast walls, towers, and fortified gates designed to protect against both sea and land attacks. However, the forts are not impenetrable. Their effectiveness depends on human presence and management. Soldiers rotate patrols, maintain gates, and coordinate signals between towers. You notice that daily vigilance repairing walls, inspecting gates, monitoring harbor activity is more important than any single display of martial strength. Trade dominates life. European merchants bring textiles, metalwork, and wine. Local farmers and artisans provide grain, olives, and livestock. Markets operate on schedules that balance supply, demand, and the threat of attack. Even minor disruptions, a delayed ship, a damaged warehouse, a raiding party can ripple through the economy, affecting food availability, tax revenue, and morale. Residents adapt by storing surplus, adjusting purchases, or coordinating small caravans under guard. Communication is continuous but fragile. Messages travel by sea to acre, by land to inland fortresses, and by courier between villages. Delays or interception of information can be critical. You observe that networks of trust and local knowledge are vital. Messengers must be reliable, signals must be understood, and informal intelligence often determines whether a raid is detected in time to respond. Survival depends as much on information as on walls or weapons. Daily life is layered with routines designed to manage risk. Fishermen plan trips based on tides and weather. Farmers coordinate harvests to avoid both raids and supply shortages. Merchants schedule caravans carefully, often with armed escorts. Even religious practice is shaped by these rhythms. Churches schedule services around work cycles and market days, while processions and pilgrimages are timed to avoid congestion or exposure. Life is practical, disciplined, and structured to mitigate vulnerability. Security is constant. Soldiers, militia, and watchmen maintain vigilance at all times. Patrols move along walls, roads, and beaches. Villagers learn to recognize early signs of danger, unusual smoke, unfamiliar movements, or disruptions in supply lines. Even minor errors, a neglected gate, a delayed patrol, a miscommunicated warning can threaten entire villages. You notice that survival here depends on cumulative attention to detail rather than single heroic actions. Social organization is pragmatic. Latin authorities dominate politically, but Arab, Syriac, and local Christian communities continue to manage religious, economic, and judicial affairs internally. Leaders negotiate disputes, enforce selective laws, and manage taxation carefully to avoid unrest. Cooperation is necessary. Coercion is dangerous. You observe that authority in the county is maintained less through force than through negotiation, coordination, and mutual dependence. The coastal geography itself shapes behavior. Access to the sea facilitates trade, reinforcement, and communication, but also exposes the population to naval raids or storms. Inland, the plains and roads are exposed to raiders. You see that strategic choices from where to build a fortress to how to route a caravan depend on both geography and human networks. Awareness of terrain and timing is crucial. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, the port of Jaffa glows with lanterns and torchlight. Ships rock gently in the harbor, gates are secured, and patrols continue their careful rounds. The rhythm of life here, commerce, vigilance, social negotiation, and adaptation sustains the county. Yet beneath the calm, you sense the ever-present tension. A city and surrounding lands reliant on human skill, foresight, and endurance, perpetually balancing opportunity with exposure. In Jaffa and Ascalon, survival is an ongoing exercise in coordination. Unlike inland territories such as Galilee, where villages rely on fortresses scattered across hills, or frontier cities like Antioch, where geography provides natural protection, the county's lifeline is a combination of trade, governance, and vigilance. Every day, the population must manage the intersection of commerce, defense, and politics, a delicate balancing act that leaves little room for error. Governance is decentralized yet interconnected. Latin nobles exercise authority through military command and administrative oversight, but they rely heavily on local elites, Arabs, Syriacs, and Christians to maintain order in villages, manage markets, and collect taxes. You notice that effective rule depends on negotiation, not force. Local leaders mediate disputes, enforce regulations, and coordinate with garrisons. Authority is relational, built on competence, fairness, and trust rather than sheer power. Trade forms the heartbeat of daily life. Ships arriving from Italy, France, and beyond bring luxury goods, tools, wine, and grain. Local farmers and artisans supply food, livestock, olive oil, and textiles. Markets operate on predictable rhythms, but adjustments are constant. Storms delay ships, raiders threaten caravans, and seasonal variations influence supply. Merchants, garrison leaders, and farmers coordinate carefully, creating informal intelligence networks to anticipate disruptions. You begin to see that economic resilience is inseparable from security. Harbor management is critical. Ships must be unloaded efficiently, goods stored safely, and routes monitored for both internal and external threats. Dockworkers, sailors, and soldiers work in coordinated routines, reinforced by signaling systems using flags, horns, and fires. Even small lapses, a missecured shipment, a misread signal can cascade into shortages or vulnerability. Daily life depends on precise attention to both timing and procedure. Security operates on multiple levels. Soldiers patrol walls, towers, and roads. Militia members supplement garrisons in surrounding villages. Watchmen scan both land and sea. Villagers internalize these practices, learning to recognize threats and respond appropriately. You notice that survival is a collective process. The city and its surrounding lands function only because civilians and soldiers alike adhere to structured routines and communicate effectively. Resource management is a constant preoccupation. Grain, wine, and livestock are carefully monitored. Wells and cisterns supply water, while fields and pastures are managed to prevent depletion. Contingency planning is routine. Food is stockpiled, supply routes mapped, and watch rotations established. Even minor errors, a misallocated shipment, a neglected cistern, a delayed patrol can affect both immediate survival and long-term stability. Daily life unfolds within these constraints. Farmers tend fields, artisans repair tools, cooks ration food, and merchants prepare caravans for market. Children observe routines and learn early the necessity of awareness and cooperation. Religious practice continues, but is often adapted to logistical realities. Processions and pilgrimages are scheduled to avoid interfering with defense or commerce, while clergy advise on both spiritual and practical matters. Faith reinforces endurance, providing structure and social cohesion alongside ritual. Communication is vital and fragile. Messengers carry information between the ports, inland villages, and other Crusader states. Delays, intercepted messages, or miscommunication can be disastrous. You notice that trust and reliability are as important as physical infrastructure. Knowing whom to trust, which routes are safe, and how to interpret signals becomes an integral part of daily life. Survival relies on accurate observation and measured responses. Tension is constant, even in periods of calm. Storms can damage docks and crops, raiders may strike inland, political alliances may shift unpredictably. Each threat requires careful preparation, adaptive strategies, and cooperation between multiple actors. You see that life in Jaffa and Ascalon is defined not by dramatic battles but by continuous attention to risk and the quiet endurance of routine. As twilight descends over the Mediterranean, lanterns glow along the harbor, gates are secured, and patrols maintain vigilance. The city and its surrounding lands are alive with the quiet rhythm of survival. Commerce, governance, defense, and coordination interwoven into daily life. And as you observe from the walls, you may wonder, how long can such a delicate balance endure under the pressures of politics, environment, and human error? What unseen cracks might appear that could disrupt this fragile coastal system? In Jaffa and Ascalon, the true test of survival arrives not in moments of calm, but during crises. Unlike inland strongholds like Galilee or crossroads cities like Antioch, the county is exposed on multiple fronts. The Mediterranean allows rapid arrival of reinforcements or trade, but also exposes the coast to raiders and storms. Inland, plains, and roads are vulnerable to incursions from rival powers. Every emergency from naval attack to inland raid, from failed harvest to disease outbreak, reveals the delicate balance upon which daily life depends. When a threat emerges, the county shifts seamlessly into coordinated response. Soldiers patrol walls and roads, signaling towers communicate alerts, and village militias are mobilized to reinforce weak points. Trade slows or halts, livestock is moved to safety, and food is rationed carefully. You notice that success in these moments is rarely the result of heroic action. Instead, it stems from cumulative preparation and disciplined adherence to routines established over years. The harbor, which is the lifeblood of the county, requires particular attention. Ships may arrive bringing supplies, troops, or messages, but timing is critical. Storms, enemy ships, or miscommunication can disrupt operations, threatening both sustenance and strategic advantage. Dock workers, sailors, and guards work in tandem, ensuring that cargo is unloaded, stored, and protected efficiently. Even minor mistakes, a miscounted shipment, a delayed signal, or a misrouted caravan can have disproportionate consequences. Resource management becomes paramount during crises. Grain, water, livestock, and tools are monitored meticulously. Supplies are rationed according to priority, garrisons first, then essential civilian needs. Strategic reserves are drawn down carefully, with an eye toward both immediate survival and long-term sustainability. You see that endurance in Jaffa and Ascalon is as much about judicious calculation as it is about courage or strength. Communication networks are tested rigorously. Messengers carry updates to neighboring counties and Crusader states. Signals relay immediate threats. Information must be both timely and accurate. You notice how reliance on trusted intermediaries, redundancy in signaling systems, and careful observation all contribute to the county's resilience. A single miscommunication can leave a village exposed or a convoy vulnerable. Survival is an orchestration of human networks as much as walls or weapons. The county's governance structure is both challenged and reinforced during crises. Latin nobles coordinate with local leaders to enforce regulations, resolve disputes, and maintain morale. Authority relies on competence and trust. Mismanagement can erode confidence quickly. You observe that leadership here is not about commanding obedience, but about creating functional networks capable of responding to unforeseen threats while maintaining daily life. Despite vigilance, crises inevitably bring stress. Disease can spread quickly through dense populations or among displaced villagers. Famine or crop failure can exacerbate shortages. Raids can destroy property, disrupt trade, or undermine confidence. Yet even under these pressures, the population adapts. People follow established routines, cooperate across communities, and rely on both experience and foresight to navigate danger. Survival is continuous, cumulative, and quietly heroic in its own way. Once a crisis subsides, the county enters a period of restoration. Repairs to walls, roads, and docks are prioritized. Food stocks are replenished, livestock replaced, and trade resumes cautiously. Lessons from the crisis are embedded in practice. Watch schedules are refined, signaling systems upgraded, and supply chains improved. You notice that resilience is built incrementally, through cycles of stress and recovery rather than through singular victories. The story of Jaffa and Ascalon demonstrates the quiet power of coordination, planning, and adaptability. The county survives not because it is invulnerable, but because its inhabitants understand the limits of control and act strategically within them. Defense, trade, governance, and daily life are intertwined into a delicate system, maintained through vigilance, cooperation, and accumulated knowledge. Ordinary acts: repairing a wall, rationing food, observing the sea sustain survival in ways often invisible to historians or chroniclers. As night falls over the coast, lanterns illuminate the harbor, patrolling soldiers move along walls, and families retire within the safety of fortified neighborhoods. The county endures through careful orchestration of human effort and awareness, a testament to the quiet, cumulative nature of resilience. You may reflect on the subtle truth of this coastal frontier. History is shaped less by dramatic conquest than by the steady rhythm of preparation, adaptation, and the disciplined maintenance of daily life, quietly balancing prosperity against perpetual vulnerability.